Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Smith with the National Security Affairs Department with my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Levi-Sanchez, and this is a continuation of our conversation from last time on the situation in Afghanistan. Today is the 27th of August, 2021. These comments are being made in both of our personal capacities, and all opinions are strictly our own and do not reflect our employer. So Susie, today, this is a very, I think, a very dark day because we've just had the suicide attack at Kabul airport, and it seems that things are in a very chaotic state from the media images. And of course, those are the only images I have to go with. But from your sources and your expertise and your perspective, what is your assessment of the situation in Afghanistan currently?
To put it as one colleague, so just full disclosure, I'm part of a group of 1,400 expats and veterans and whatnot who are trying to basically help evacuate Afghans. And from what I understand, there are currently about 250,000 that still need to be evacuated. I'm working with 9 families, but each expat kind of is working with their own, and we all sort of share information. And why am I saying that? Because there have been various stories that are shared, and one colleague basically said that Afghanistan is quickly turning into a death trap. And they're saying that because I'm going to go around the borders of people trying to escape. So the airport is very insecure. I think last time we talked, I outlined how ISIS Khorasan was likely going to become the threat because they were going to be unhappy that the Taliban were not as adherent and didn't believe in the same principles of a sort of global Islamic caliphate. I think I talked about that at length, and here we are. Yesterday, we had this horrible tragedy, and I believe it was 12 of our troops were killed in that suicide bombing, along with 140, I think, injured. So ISIS Khorasan is ramping up more quickly again than anybody was thinking. For some reason, it seemed obvious to me that once the Taliban took control, as I put it last time, they'd want their piece of the pie. So now they're trying to get their piece of the pie, which is hurting the infidels as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and staking a claim. Some people say there's between only 1,000 and 2,000 of ISIS-K there, but those can cause quite a bit of damage in small cells all over the place. And the Taliban do not seem to be doing a very good job securing the airport, even though they, honestly, I do believe they are making a good faith effort and they're trying to, but I think it's very difficult. Because again, they invited a bunch of foreign fighters into the country. They don't know which ones are ISIS-K and which ones are not. And once you start inviting, ETIM and Ansarullah and all these other groups, how are you going to be able to tell which ones are the ISIS-K ones? So here we have a bunch that were working with the Taliban and nobody knows who's who. So that's going to get messier, and they're probably going to come in a little more. So the reason it's a death trap, or quickly becoming one, is, there are rumors circulating that the US after today is only going to be evacuating US citizens. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's been widely circulated. I do know that President Biden said that he would continue to try to find other ways to get those 250,000 Afghans out. The Taliban have said that unless the Afghans have all of their visa and papers in place and everything, those Afghans are not getting out through the airport, at least. So let's look at the borders. You have Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and then in Afghanistan, you can go also out through China. And you can also kind of like, there's a back way to get up through, really difficult way through the Afghan Pamirs. And then you go out and go through the mountains into Kyrgyzstan. But that's very difficult terrain. Most people aren't going to be able to make that. I mean, there is this other, they could go out through Iran as well. And they could go out through Iran to Chabahar and take a boat to India. They could go out through Afghanistan to Gwadar and get out to Qatar, to other places. That's a little less likely. So what I heard today is that Uzbekistan is allowing people in for 8 days if they have visas. And some are saying that if they don't have visas, but they're getting in for 8 days. If they don't get a flight out within 8 days, they're sent back to the Taliban. And basically, we know what's going to happen there. There is supposedly a German flight out from the border of Uzbekistan at Termez, I've heard. There's also allegedly Eric Prince is capitalizing on this, and he is sending out emails to a lot of us expats working on this, offering flights out of Uzbekistan for $22,000 per flight, and then another $3,000 to get a bus from the border to the plane. So it's a pretty horrific money-making scheme. And the Germans are not doing that, but there's not a lot of flights, and I don't know who has access, but it might be, I don't know. Can't talk about that because I don't know. Tajikistan, a colleague, contact of mine in Kunduz, Afghan, told me that 5 members of a family he knows had crossed the border at the Kunduz crossing. It's not the Kunduz crossing, the Friendship Bridge, and they went across, and then the Tajiks picked them up and turned around and handed them straight back to the Taliban. And again, we can imagine what happened to that family. So Tajikistan is really not wanting to let Afghans in either. And they've closed all their borders. Turkmenistan's not letting people in. Pakistan was letting some people in, and people thought there was going to be kind of a Shia bridge across the Northeast into Pakistan. And they're even not allowing some Afghans who have visas. There was an opening in Baluchistan for a bit into Pakistan, but which would be this area, but that seems to be intermittent and not fully happening. And then the Pakistanis are allowing some Afghans who have visas in through, if they got their visas in Kandahar and only in Kandahar, and then they're allowing them to cross the border into Pakistan. But if you got your visa anywhere else in Afghanistan, they're not letting you in, which says a lot.
Could you explain why is that? The Kandahar?
Because there's a kinship group that crosses the border in that area, so they're,
okay. I see.
They would be connected.
Okay.
Whereas up above, the Pakistanis often, I mean, this is not politically correct, but they often marginalize the ones in their north. And so that border is not going to be open.
Okay.
So there's some kind of connection. I'm sorry, there's some kind of connection among the kinship groups there, as far as I can tell. That's me speculating, but I'm pretty sure it's true.
Okay.
There have been some families that have been granted access to India. So when you look at the bigger picture and pull out a little bit, there's not a lot of places for these 250,000 Afghans under threat that helped us to go. And there's not a ton of options for them to be flown out for very long either, since the Taliban have said, we've promised to be out by the 31st. I don't know what the contingency plans are. Don't have any secret information, but whatever the contingency plan is, the Taliban have agreed post 31st to allow the rest of Americans and American citizens and green card holders out. But nobody really knows the fate of the Afghans. So I do know in Badakhshan, there have been reports of a number of young women that have been stolen from their homes. Badakhshan is considered to be a place where women are prized. So Taliban have taken a number of them, and I don't have a number on that. I just know it's happening. And they have take them as forced marriages. And so that is going on. There's also a number of districts in which the Taliban have enforced strict Sharia, and women are not allowed to leave their homes, or they have to be escorted by a man. Taliban have said that they will allow women to work and have education. Problem is, in most places, there's not separate girls' schools necessarily. So they'd have to build them, and they're not going to. So then you could say they're going to get education, but they have to have a place to get educated. And they're not going to allow women in many districts to work in places where men are working. So, and women have to be escorted wherever they go. So how are they going to allow that to happen? I do think in Kabul, there have been some instances that I've heard of where women are still working. There's a woman who was on Tolo News, and there have been things which we talked about last time. But it does seem like in many places, the Taliban are engaging in stricter and stricter rules and restrictions around women. And I think that is because while the Taliban were, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert on the Taliban, but I know enough, they were sort of connected across a diverse range of ethnic groups and kinship family groups, unlike many parts of Afghanistan, because they didn't want the foreigners in. So they had this sort of amalgam of groups that were willing to work together. But it's like any coup or takeover or revolution. You have the group, it coheres, and then it sort of falls apart, and different groups begin to assert their own, how they hoped it would go. So I think what's really important, what I have been telling people is, if anybody thinks that somehow the Taliban are suddenly going to have a centralized authority, when that has almost never happened in the country, that's not what's going to happen.
So that's a really important point. So because one could hopefully imagine that certain elements of the Taliban are more enlightened compared to the past. But what you're saying is that, yeah, okay, so you have some enlightened Taliban maybe in Kabul, but doesn't mean the Taliban out in the rural areas or smaller cities are going to be acting that way. So that's what I'm sensing from you.
That's right. And you also have a lot of Taliban that are kind of very young fighters. And there's a really big difference between a fighter and a professional soldier. And when a fighter is suddenly in charge of security in a random district, in Helmand or in Shebrakhan, in wherever, they're not going to suddenly become a professional soldier. There's going to be a group of fighters that are kind of like a loosely affiliated militia of sorts that are simply going to enforce what they want. So if they, I mean, there's been more stoning of women, raping of women, beating of women, forcing various rules. So it's going to depend on the ethic of that random person that doesn't have a sort of coherent ethical and moral boundary that a professional soldier might. And I'm not saying that any military is perfectly bound by they may have a coherent set of rules. They may not always adhere to them, but at least there's a form of justice for when they don't.
Yeah.
Right. And so the Taliban, is someone going to be brought up on charges for stoning a woman who's accused of walking down the street by herself or not adhering to Sharia? There's nobody to enforce that. Even if leadership in let's say Baradar doesn't agree with that in Kabul, he's kind of the CEO of the Taliban at the moment, as they say. How's he going to enforce that? Even if he disagrees with it. So I don't know. I mean, it sort of remains to be seen. But some of the things that have gone on, they've had on loudspeaker in Balkh. And Balkh is in the north. Balkh is a very old city, spiritual city. It has its own way of doing things, and it does not adhere to strict Sharia. But the Taliban is really trying to get them to, and so they've been, there were some clashes last week, and I don't know what's going on now, actually. I do know that in the Wakhan, where July 4th is when the Taliban took over the northeast districts in Badakhshan, the ones I usually work in, which are in this area of Afghanistan. When they first took over, the Afghans and the leadership, the local leaders there, were actually kind of hopeful, because the Taliban came in. The local leaders said, fine, pick a Taliban district governor, we'll accept them. And then the Taliban left. About a week later, Taliban came back and destroyed the police headquarters in the center of Wakhan, just to show that they were in charge. Then they left. So one of my contacts, who is studying at a Chinese university, he's the son of probably the most powerful local leader in the Wakhan. He was planning on going back to Afghanistan and teaching English, and then coming to the US for a master's. Very bright kid. I think I've talked about him, and he's now seeking asylum. He feels he never wanted to become a citizen of a foreign country. And his dad, who he feels is in imminent danger, is refusing to leave, and his grandfather. So he's really scared for his family now. And that has been going on across northeastern Badakhshan. Whereas before they were kind of feeling, oh, this might be okay. They're no longer feeling that. And so I was contacted today by 3 terrified Afghans from Badakhshan begging for me to help them to get out. I was kind of hoping that Tajikistan would allow a bridge through the country, just for people then to get to third countries, but they're not at this point, because there are 21 informal crossings right in this area that they could get around the Taliban, because they can't cross borders right now where the Taliban, most of them, where the Taliban are in control. But there are these informal crossings, so there are many ways for them to get out around the Taliban. But if the Tajiks are just going to arrest them and send them back, they'll be killed or imprisoned or beat up, whatever will happen. Children taken, kidnapped. I mean, it's a nightmare, basically.
So the people who contacted you, they're obviously afraid, and you probably had limited answers or limited options, or.
Well, for example, I've been really sick and today was a good day.
Mhm.
So I started at 8 this morning. And an Afghan that contacted me sent me all his paperwork. He had worked for the US Army Corps of Engineers, and he had worked in the Afghan National Army as an engineer, and he worked alongside and for the US Army. And then he did a training on OSHA standards at Kansas State University, funded by Army Corps of Engineers. And he sent me all of his paperwork, his ID, his dad's ID, who did as well. His family's in danger. The Taliban are after him. I spent 2 hours on the phone with Kansas State University, with the vice president's office, with the president's office, with the mechanical and nuclear engineering office, only to find out that they can't figure out, because what I needed from them was who they got the grant from at US Army Corps of Engineers, because I'd need to contact that person to get the referral letter for this Afghan. This Afghan cannot get out of the country properly without a referral that he proves that he worked for the US government. Everybody on his list that he worked for has disappeared. Their numbers are disconnected and their emails aren't working. So I sent them all the documentation only to finally find out that they can't find the grant number and they don't have any of the contacts. So we found one US Army contact for this guy that I sent an email to, and that guy's ignoring the emails. So that's one case. Another case that I worked on today is a gentleman who taught me Pashto and Dari for free. He was working with our US Special Operations Forces, and someone in our military told him about me in 2010, and he contacted me and he started teaching me for free. Really good guy. His father was a general under Najibullah, and he helped the US, his father as the general helped the US back in the 90s. And this friend of mine trained both as a cultural advisor and Pashto Dari language trainer for not only SOF, but other branches of our military. And then he was given US citizenship. And his brother is serves in the parliament. We had talked about him last time. So update on that story, brothers in the parliament. Taliban has visited threateningly his house 3 times. He's been hiding. He has a wife and 2 kids. They have expired passports, so they can't get a visa. They have something called Tazkira, I believe it's called, and that's their paperwork that is like birth certificates to prove, whatever. So the US will allow those, but the Taliban won't allow those. And neither will Pakistan or a number of other, Russia won't either, because he does have a brother in Russia. So his brother, my friend has a brother in Russia, but he can't go there because the passport is expired and the passport office isn't working in Afghanistan. So there's no way. And so the Taliban are blocking any Afghans who have expired or don't have passports from getting passports. And then they're using that as a reason for not allowing those Afghans to leave the country. So we, today, my contact and I contacted 2 representatives, and we sent all the paperwork to them. And the really ugly story here is that his brother, the parliamentarian, also worked for a US military contractor. So he also should get a referral letter from that to get in and be evacuated. But that US military contractor hired a supervisor who's from Turkey. So when his brother contacted that supervisor in Turkey, because that's who he'd need the letter from to prove that he worked for the US, the supervisor in Turkey said, unless your brother, the American citizen, sends me his passport to vouch for my 4 Turkish family members who also worked on this project, I'm not going to write the letter for you. And I said to my friend, you can't vouch for 4 Turks you don't know, because this guy's blackmailing. And so his brother can't get that letter because of the blackmail. And there's a lot of that going on. There's also a lot of on the streets, these offers to rescue people, and basically their schemes for either stealing money or kidnapping. You know, there's all kinds of schemes going on the streets for people who are desperate. And that there's a whole weird market for that going on that's really ugly.
Inside Afghanistan. Like,
yeah, inside Afghanistan. It's a nightmare.
Oh, this is a pretty bleak picture.
I'm sorry. You know, I've been dealing with this every time I'm healthy enough.
Yeah.
This is what I'm doing.
I really admire you for doing that.
Well, I'm not looking for that. I just actually, you know, I feel really good. I think I've helped, like, one guy I helped for 2 days to get a letter from Mercy Corps because they kept trying to deny him. And so when I stepped in and I sent the paperwork, they finally listened, and then HR gave him a letter. But up until I actually directly intervened, they were treating him, they were ignoring him completely. AKD, Aga Khan Development Network, was doing the same thing. They denied him because he had worked on a project that wasn't clearly enough USAID. So then we had to track down an HR officer in Canada who could prove that one of the projects he worked on was indeed a grant from USAID. That took a week and a half. These are just 250,000 of these stories where people are not in these organizations and governments stepping up and simply doing their part. And that's what I said to Kansas State University today. I said, you need to step up and do your part. Well, they didn't, but they are looking into they're trying to find the contract number. Because once you have the contract number, then you can contact the people who funded that contract, or at least the agency or department or whatever. So it's a whole, and now the expats I'm part of, we are all talking about trying to form a larger NGO that will create basically immigrant bridges along borders for the Afghans, and to try to negotiate those over time, and to pressure different governments to do that. So, and you asked me earlier before we started, was there sort of any positive? Like, the positives are that one could imagine that some pundits are talking about is the Taliban is going to create a coherent country. Somehow people believe in the Taliban, they follow the Taliban. The reason the Taliban took over is because the people wanted that. No, the people didn't, they didn't really want that. They didn't want to die in a lot of places. Certainly there's some Taliban supporters, but in a lot of places there's not. So I think the things that people were hoping, which is the Taliban would work with the international community. They might, but that doesn't mean they're going to be able to work coherently across Afghanistan. And then the other question is, how are the banks are shut down? You can't get money in or out of Afghanistan right now. So even if you want to fund certain things, you can't. So some people are paying for charter flights out of different parts just to get groups of people out. But it's been, some of those charter flights are even half full because they can't get the Afghans to the places where the flights are safely.
Do you know if a group is arranging a charter flight, which airport would they use, and wouldn't there be security problems associated with that? I'm assuming it's not Kabul.
There were a couple DoD sanctioned charter flights out of Kabul.
Oh, okay.
But I have heard also there was one, but again, hearsay, but I heard there was one out of Mazar, and I can't remember. There was one, I think, in Herat.
Okay.
It was going to Iran. There was one that went to India, and I forget so there's been there are airports, little airports all over the place. So there have been places. I mean, you could actually charter a flight. There's an airport about 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers out of Ishkashim, which is right here.
Mm.
So you could stealthily charter a flight out of there, you know.
Mm.
It depends on how many Taliban are where. So,
yeah.
Then I don't know enough about where I know that not all the flights are going out of Kabul, but they're also not very successful, and they're expensive, very expensive. And people are carpet bagging, just, you know, we're profiteering off of it too, to an extent.
Mm.
Some are humanitarian flights and some aren't. So.
All right, Susie, I think we'll wrap it up there. It's very, at this point, a bit on the grim side, but very realistic. I really appreciate your insights and hearing about your efforts to help folks over there. So I just.
My only fear is that by next week, all of this is going to be like old information. So maybe next time we, you know.
Yeah, well, we're just recording it as we go, and we're documenting it as we go, and we don't quite know what the future will bring, but we can hope for the best, I guess.
I think the next time we talk, just to give a little forecasting, yes. I think we should talk about sort of models of state formation, or what a state looks like in these regions. Okay. And so we can look at kind of why it failed so badly in Afghanistan, because I have a lot to say about that.
Okay, and that is why U.S. efforts to cultivate governance were not successful for various reasons.
That's right.
Okay.
And I'd like to talk about that.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, well, we'll wrap it up there, and thank you very much. And that's going to be a wrap, so I will end it now.